Um, Taco Bell also. All right. Okay, so the era of good feelings is discover. Okay, I wonder. Yeah, some of us are. Sorry. Welcome, welcome. Hey, all right, we are here. I apologize for being late today. Um, so I want to talk today about the end of the era of good feelings and the sort of panic of 1819, how we get to that, and some of the changes, the technological changes that are going to take place in this period, and just the way in which the world is changing once the Mississippi becomes opened, and uh, we see a drastic transformation in the economy. Bear with me here for a sec. The Napoleonic bust, we'll call it. Okay, I'm muted. Okay, yeah. So if you might check your voice. Oh, let's see. Kennedy and Soph have me muted. You can hear fine. Oh, you fixed it. Okay. All right. You guys can hear. Okay. Boy, lots of issues today. Sorry about that. Oh, lagging internet. Okay. All right. So today I want to talk about how the Mississippi gets uncorked and some of the changes that take place in this period. So we talked about before. What's the major reason that the Mississippi River, the thing that changes, that makes the Mississippi River accessible for Western expansion? What makes these boatmen here on in this image jolly? This image is called the Jolly Boatman. Um, why are these? What's and they're on the Mississippi River. And what about the Mississippi River has changed? It's not the cotton gin, not yet. Steam engine. So this is about 1815. Louisiana Purchase. Excellent. No more French. Excellent. Exactly at 11:10. For today, you should be fine. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So the Jolly Boatmen are the reason the boatmen are jolly are not yet steam engines, but the Louisiana Purchase and the French and the Spanish no longer control New Orleans. Remember that Spain had it, and then they sold it to France. And we have, to some extent, we have Toussaint Louverture to thank for that, because Napoleon's plan was to land with 30,000 soldiers in New Orleans and take this and build a kind of extension of the French Empire. This fails miserably, and the Saint-Domingue becomes an independent black republic called Haiti. And as a result, in a fit of pique, Napoleon gives up New Orleans, sells it to the Americans, and the U.S. now has access up and down the Mississippi River. This is another image of the Jolly Boatman. And what's interesting about this, remember that the rivers only go one direction. And so that means that it's easy to get down the Ohio River and down the Mississippi River, but it's actually quite difficult to go back up. Does that make sense? So you can get down the Mississippi River all the way to New Orleans, and then your goods, say your barrels of flour or something like that, and you can see those barrels of flour and sacks of probably, what are those sacks? Those are probably sacks of wheat in the image. All of these things are going to go down the Mississippi River, and this boat that's going to go down the Mississippi River carrying the products of these, and there's a tierce of rice probably that this fellow is sitting on here. A tierce is about 1/6 of a ton or a third of a barrel, and they're carrying this stuff down the Mississippi River. But that boat that they're on is going to be destroyed when they get to New Orleans, right? When they get to New Orleans in, say, 1812 or 1815, The boat can't go back up. You can't go back up the Mississippi River without steamboats. And so, as a result, lots of houses in New Orleans are built with the handmade boats that are used just for one journey down the Mississippi River. Does that make sense? So these craft, the boatmen's craft, are going to be built. They're going to pole themselves down the Mississippi River. They're going to have built the craft during the year for all the goods that are going to flow from, say, for half a dozen or so farmers. They're going to come down to New Orleans, and then the ship is going to be turned upside down and turned into a house in New Orleans. And so if you go to New Orleans now, say you go for Mardi Gras or something like that, you can still see houses that are built from old boats. Okay, so people take their flour down to New Orleans. Ultimately, it's going to be bound for the West Indies. The U.S. exports about 1 million barrels a year of flour down the Mississippi River. It exports about 700,000 barrels of pork, beef, and rice to the West Indies. The U.S. needs the West Indies. Remember again that the West Indies that's where all the wealth is being generated by enslaved people in the Caribbean. And the U.S. is basically an adjunct to that trade in the period that we're talking about. So how do you get back up, right? You've gone from Louisville, Kentucky, say, to all the way down to the New Orleans to sell your goods. And then at the end, you're going to take your goods back up what's called the Natchez Trace. The Natchez Trace, or Natchez Road, is a road that takes you all the way back up, say, to Nashville. And if you're coming from Cleveland or from Pittsburgh or something like that, you're going to go, again, mostly by road all the way up, okay, to sell your goods. This is not the most efficient method of delivering your flour to West Indies, but it's really the only way to do it up to, say, 1815 or so. And the problem with shipping your goods this way is, one of the problems is these two folks. They're called, oh, sorry, you can't see the Big Harp and Little Harp. The Harp brothers. And the Harp brothers are very likely, or there's a distinct possibility that Harp brothers or someone like them is going to rob you on the way back up the Natchez Trace. So the Natchez Trace is a dangerous place. It's estimated that the Harp brothers killed about 24 people who came back up the Natchez Trace. They basically hid in the woods and the swamps, killed people, and filled their bodies with rocks and threw them back in rivers so that no one would be able to find them for many years. The last, it's between, say, I want to say 1805 and 1811 or something like that, that the Harp brothers have their most powerful years. And around 1812, Big Harp is finally caught, his little brother shortly after. Their heads are put on pikes, and this becomes Harp's Head, Kentucky. Okay, so selling goods, right? These are the first, probably, as far as we know, the first mass murderers in American history. And just to give you a sense of the dangers of this trip, this is going to change around 1811 or 1812, and is going to be resolved in a few ways. One of them is going to be with the development of paper money, and the other is going to be with the steamboat, because the steamboat allows you to move back and forth up the Mississippi River. Okay, a little bit of background to what this world looks like, this trading world looks like. The French Revolutionary Wars are from 1791 to 1803. In 1803, Napoleon is in command of the army and in command of the French state. And the Napoleonic Wars, he expands into Spain and Italy and Switzerland, the Rhine, and also Poland. He defeats those powers, and he's finally stopped in 1815. Around the same time, that this is during the time that this is happening, the U.S. is basically exporting flour, which is going all the way down the Mississippi River and then out to places like Spain and Italy, as well as Great Britain, all of whom are being blocked off, don't have access to grain, in part because soldiers are fighting, in part because Napoleon is capturing all these ports. And so the Americans are engaged in a considerable amount of smuggling to get these goods to European buyers. Wheat flour prices are $15 to $20 a barrel, which is very, very high in this period. And you can make a tremendous fortune by selling goods to Europe. So people are selling goods primarily to the West Indies, but also to Europe in this period from 1791 to 1815. Does that make sense? Oh, is there a musical? That's right. I need to find out about that. Oh, that sounds great. Okay, so let me. I'm just going to skip this section since we're a little bit late and say that around 1815. So what the paper money does. So if that's a good question, is basically it allows you to. It's safer than gold or silver because what Big Harp and Little Harp were doing was knocking you out, taking your gold and silver after killing you and your horse, and running away with it. If you had paper money, you could return to New Orleans if you survived and advertise that you had been robbed, and and the paper money would have a number on it, which you would have written down and saved or kept with a friend or something like that. And so the paper money made your money basically safer getting back up the Mississippi River. Okay. Another important change that takes place right around 1815 or so is once the War of 1812 is over. Yeah, like a debit card, right? Right, where you remember the number of the debit card, and if somebody steals your debit card, then you can reclaim it. I'll show you a picture of one. This is what the currency looks like in this period, and as you can see, this is a $5 bill, which is quite a bit of money in that period. Maybe something like $150 now. Whoops. And I keep messing up my proportions here. Give me a second. And it's a little hard to see, but there's a date here, 28 December 1818. There's the signature of the president of the bank. Oh, and up here at the top, it's faded now, is the number of the banknote. And so if you're robbed, you can point out the number of the banknote and get your money back. Okay, so what I want to suggest is we can't really understand the U.S. unless we understand the rest of the world. The West Indies is a massive importer of food. 1 million barrels of flour, about 700,000 barrels of beef and pork, and Indian corn and rice that's being imported to the West Indies. But also the fact that Europe is at war is especially good for the United States because the U.S. can trade goods with Europe. Wheat fields are burning all over Europe because of Napoleon's invasions, and this is tremendously good for the United States because the United States can export all of this flour and these other goods there as well. Maybe, yeah, it's quite possible. There was a lot of scamming in these places, and actually one place. Let me just look at this netch. I don't have a good map of the Mississippi River today, but there was a place in Illinois. I wonder if it's on this map here. Let's see, Tennessee. So basically up here in Illinois, there was a little island right on the edge that was accessible from 3 different states, and it was a place where people did all sorts of didn't just rob people, but also established all sorts of scams where they would capture an enslaved person, pretend to be returning them, and then collect what's the word, the ransom for the person as they were brought back. So yeah. that's lots of opportunities for scams in this period. This Kleinwort and Sons creates something called the Blackball Line. And the Blackball Line is what makes New York City the most important city in the United States. Previously, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Baltimore, even Boston, were kind of neck and neck with New York. But once Kleinwort and Sons creates the Blackball Line, it creates regular delivery between the U.S. and Great Britain after the War of 1812. We see basically New York pull way ahead of the other cities on the East Coast. New York goes from being competitive with Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and New York to being way ahead of them. Much larger, much more productive. And these ships are massive ships, the Blackball Line, 380 tons in 1815, twice as big, 760 tons of freight that's going back and forth in around 1820 or so. And it's this regular trade with Great Britain that helps make New York really, really powerful and really important. Okay. So a little bit about the background to 1819. Yeah, the Blackball Line is a ship, and you see the black ball there is the image. That's how recognize the ship. The ship sailed regularly, so every Tuesday, I think, it went from New York to Liverpool, and every Friday, a ship went from Liverpool to New York. It took 24 days to go from New York to Liverpool, and something like 30 days to get from Liverpool back to New York. And so this was a regular shipment, and this regular shipment meant that you could sell goods in Great Britain, and you didn't have to worry about the 3 to 4 week time that it took previously. It's a shorter time, but it's also a much more regular time. And so if you get your goods together by Tuesday, you can ship them off from New York to London. They just had 5 or 6 ships, but they guaranteed that every Tuesday a ship was going to leave New York, and that every Friday a ship was going to leave from Great Britain, from Liverpool, actually, not from London, but from Liverpool. Okay. All right. So here's some things that are changing, and that I think help us understand why the Panic of 1819 is going to happen. First of all, after 1815, we see caterpillar banks. These are banks, this is what they're called by their critics, and caterpillar banks provide credit for steamboats and speed up the commerce on the Mississippi, Ohio, and Hudson rivers. Many of these banks are unstable. So this, for example, is a note from the Cumberland Bank of Burkesville. And, oops. The Cumberland Bank of Burkesville, and you can see here actually in the image is these little ships that are being constructed in this period and then abandoned. And these notes are supposedly worth $5. The trouble is to get $5 in silver or gold with one of these notes, and the note is more secure than $5 in silver or gold. You actually have to figure out where Burkesville is. And so people are passing these notes back and forth, but the banks are often fairly far away from markets. And so we see a whole bunch of these banks emerge along the banks of the rivers. And a lot of them are shady banks. People call them caterpillars, just like the very hungry caterpillar, right? They eat everything in their path, is the story. So that where banks used to be the pillars of the nation, they are now the caterpillars. They just devour everything in front of them. The difficulty with these notes is, the great thing about these notes is they make it possible, much easier to trade up and down the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. The difficulty is the difficulty is the opportunity for scamming. The Very Hungry Caterpillar, the book is 1960 or so, but the idea that a caterpillar eats everything in its path is much older than that. It's like 200 years. If you look at a caterpillar or notice a caterpillar, when a caterpillar moves, it just devours leaves and all these other sorts of things. But the story of a caterpillar as being voracious and basically devouring everything it sees is very old. Yeah, so part of the problem with these, it's a great question. Part of the problem with these notes, these Caterpillar bank notes, is that banks emerged in this period, and they didn't have as much gold or silver as they claimed to have, and they weren't very well regulated. So, for example, Kentucky had what was called a litter of banks, basically created 40 banks in 1816, and they had supposedly $20 million worth of notes. They issued about $20 million worth of banknotes, and they had no gold or silver in their vaults at all. Okay, so some of these banks were just basically scams from the beginning. People accepted the notes as long as they traded them, but they sometimes traded at a discount. And so if you brought a bank note from the Cumberland Bank of Burkesville into New Orleans, you might get, for a $5 note, you might be asked to take a discount of, say, $1 or something like that. So they'd give you $4 worth of goods for a $5 bill because they doubt the value of that note. But if you took it to New York City, where they're much more careful about their notes, you might only get $1 or 50 cents or something like that from the note. The litter was in Kentucky. Yeah, it's a litter of banks. It's called a litter of banks because cats have lots and lots of kittens, and so the Bank of Kentucky created this so many banks, a whole bunch of banks all at once, none of which actually had any capital at all. Okay, so this is some of the scamming that happens in this period. It's well, you'd actually have to take someone to the magistrate to do this. It would have to be fairly complicated if you paid with a note and then. Well, if you paid with a note and then said it was stolen, oh, I see. If you paid somebody with a note and then said it was stolen afterwards, in many cases you'd have to come before a magistrate. You'd have to swear before the magistrate that this had happened. It was possible, but you could get in a lot of trouble if it was discovered that you had actually bought something with a note. Yeah, and you also had receipts, so people might have receipts from you. It was an excellent time to be a scammer, I think. If the legal background of this period is any indication, there's a tremendous amount of scamming that was taking place. Okay, so while there's a great deal of scamming, this is actually great for commerce. The proliferation of banks is actually fairly good, and what we see is lots and lots of banks emerging, and I think what we see is lots and lots of trade. All right. Okay, so how did credit work? How did these banks work? So the idea of the store in before 1820 meant basically a place where you put things. A store as a place to buy something emerges right around this period, 1815 to 1819, and the store was a place where you could show up and get consumer credit if you were a farmer. The man or the woman who ran the store would ask who you were and where you lived and how much acreage you had and what you were growing. And based on that, it's quite possible they already knew that because the store was the center for gossip in this period. And you'd be given credit for the goods that were brought in to this store. So the store sold groceries, goods in gross, by the dozens of dozens, and you would get something like a plow, as you can see here, or a barrel of rice, possibly. You'd get needles, you'd get thread, you'd get jackets, not jackets, but fabric that you could use to make jackets. You'd get horse collars and jugs and things like that. All of these things, and you pay for them by credit. You'd basically, there'd be someone would write down your name and write down what you'd bought. And then when harvest time came, you would bring your goods to this store, turn over what you had, whether it was butter or potash or flour or something like that, and in return, the store would cancel your credit. Okay, so this was basically how credit worked. That credit was then used to load up ships with the produce of farmers. These ships would then go down the Mississippi River, sell those goods in New Orleans, where someone else would buy them and trade them in. Might take them all the way to Italy, more often take it to the West Indies or something like that for sale and bring it back. Okay, so the whole chapter that we read for this week is about the expansion of the United States. And I guess my take on all this is we can't really understand this until we understand there's a sort of complicated credit networks that emerge. More transactional or burgeoning? I'm not sure what. It's definitely transactional, and it's definitely growing. Burgeoning is growing, right? So there is a great deal of scamming, but I would say bargaining. Okay, cool. So this was basically the way it worked. If you went into the store, is you would basically say, I need plows, plow points, I need horse feed, these sorts of things. The farmer would sell them to you at a set price, which would be inflated to take care of the fact that you were paying later, and then what you would do is you would agree to sell your goods at whatever the price in the newspaper was for that week. So if flour was trading at $10 a barrel, you'd bring in 10 barrels, you'd get $100 worth of credit, and you might walk away with $50 if you bought $50 worth of goods. So basically, the store was a place that was the first place that you went usually if you were a farmer to sell your goods. You might actually take some of the remaining barrels if you could settle your debt for 5 barrels of flour. You might then go to Louisville or something like that and sell your barrels of flour there to somebody who was operating a ship, who would then sell it in return. Okay, so there was an established price for these goods. That basically the newspaper would be the agreed upon price. So there would be a Nashville price, a New Orleans price, and a price in Italy. And the price would go up, obviously, the closer and closer you got to the market. Okay. So what's going on? Why this expansion of credit? Yeah, this expansion of credit that's taking place is taking place in part, and the creation of all these banks is taking place in part because the first Bank of the United States, which I don't have here, the first Bank of the United States, established between 1791 and ending in 1811, no longer exists, right? So the first Bank of the United States is gone, and there's no centralized U.S. bank. There's no Federal Reserve. There's no major U.S. bank that's established by Congress, and as a result, every state sets up their own banks, and some of them are legitimate and solid banks, like many of the New York and Boston banks. And some of them are banks with very little credit, like the Louisville banks. And some are banks that are just created by little towns that just sort of establish banks on their own. So in 1815, when the Second Bank of the United States is formed, part of the reason it's formed is to try to stem the flow of credit to the caterpillar banks, because they think, the expansion of banks, this proliferation of banks, is a problem because some of these banks are fundamentally unstable. Okay, so this long term, this is why when you buy it, when you go to the, if you're shopping around for a bank in Athens, say, or in Atlanta, you have 30 or 40 banks to choose from. That's not true anywhere else in the world, but in the United States, partly because of the legacy of this period, we see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of banks that are formed, and those banks, some of them go away, many of them go away, but a lot of them remain. And the fact that we have something like 1,000 different chartered banks in the United States goes all the way back to this period, where there was really no single bank, central bank in the United States, and as a result, we see the proliferation of lots of little banks. So the Second Bank of the United States, when it's set up in 1815, and remember 1815 is after the War of 1812, is designed to stem the flow of credit to the caterpillar banks. But it's not very effective at doing this. It can't really force these banks to pay in gold or silver for the currency that they're issuing. Okay. All right, so all of this is to say that from, say, 1793, so why? Sorry. Why can't they do it? In part because Congress won't let them. If you're a congressman from Kentucky, you don't want them to close down your 40 banks in Kentucky. You don't want them to criticize your banks, and so Congress is effectively unable to do this. And the Second Bank of the United States doesn't really have the authority to do this. The Second Bank of the United States starts to issue its own credit, and the way that the new bank is set up, it actually provides a lot of opportunities for credit, particularly for people who are close to the bank, who are connected to the bank in one way or another. Okay. Around 1817 or 1818, we see New England merchants and manufacturers who persuade the U.S. to block the flood of cheap British goods. Britain has been sending all these goods over to the United States on these ships like the Black Ball Line and others. A lot of manufacturers and merchants are somewhat upset about this because as they see it, there won't be as many manufactured goods in the United States. These merchants believe that Britain is dumping these goods, that it's selling lots of goods below the established price after the War of 1812 in a way of as a way of destroying American manufacturing, and so they persuade the U.S. to block the flow of cheap American goods by creating what are called the American Navigation Acts. And the American Navigation Acts established tariffs or basically taxes on goods that are coming in from Great Britain on the Black Ball Line and other places like that. As you can imagine, Britain is not happy about this. Britain is not happy about having its goods blocked. And in May of 1818, Britain responds to the American Navigation Acts by passing what are called British Orders in Council. And what they do is block American flour from the British Caribbean. They prevent American flour from getting to the American merchants from trading directly with the British West Indies. The only way you can trade with the British West Indies is to take your goods all the way up to Halifax in Nova Scotia, sell them there. This is the Corn Laws, but this is the 1818 version of the Corn Laws. So the Corn Laws are passed in 1815, but the 1818 version of the Corn Laws extends those tariffs on cheap grain to the Caribbean. And that's where most of the American flour is going, is to the Caribbean. Okay, so in May of 1818, in retaliation for the American Navigation Acts, we get Corn Laws too, Electric Boogaloo. Which is the blocking of American flour to the British Caribbean. Okay, so I said before, it's officially called the Orders in Council. It's confusing because it's basically an extension of Corn Laws. The trouble is that all British control of navigation is called Orders in Council, but this is basically what happens: is the May 1818 Orders in Council block, or don't block, but make it very, very difficult for Americans to sell their flour in the British West Indies. Okay, so we've got credit here, right? We've got a credit system where merchants are borrowing, where farmers are borrowing from stores. Stores are borrowing from banks. Banks, in turn, are issuing credit, sometimes without a lot of gold and silver to back it up. Does that make sense? By May of 1818, once the orders of council are published and they reach the U.S. by October of 1818, right, like Kentucky, what we see is the price of flour barrels goes from $10 a barrel to $5 a barrel. Okay? Flour prices drop 50%. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that the merchants who are selling to the British West Indies are stuck with these flour barrels that they can't sell. Some of them, they try to go to Cuba. Cuba says there's too much flour, right? And so they go bankrupt. So what we see is bankruptcy first among shippers. Then we see bankruptcy here among these shippers that are going up and down the Mississippi River. And then we see bankruptcy of the farmers who now are being told when they arrive at the store, yes, we've agreed that you've got a $40 debt or a $50 debt, but it's not 5 barrels that's going to pay off your debt. It's 10 barrels. It's all your flour that's going to be used to pay off this debt. And so what we see then as a result of this trade war between the United States and Great Britain is flour prices plummet 50%. And as a result, land prices plummet, right? Because people can't, no one wants to buy land after 1818 because no one wants to buy land because the prices of flour has dropped 50%. And so land prices go down. But also all these people who bought land on credit from the land office now have to pay it off and can't pay it off. So over 400,000 acres of land in 1819 goes up for public auction. Farmers who have land, who have bought it on credit from the banks and from the land office, are forced to turn over their land, surrender the land back to the United States. The United States doesn't sell those acres, those 400,000 acres, until 1865. They're still trying to sell that land 40 years later. That's the Panic of 1819. The Panic of 1819 is probably the biggest panic, financial panic in the 19th century. And it's one that leads to drastic change in the politics, and it leads to basically what's called the end of the era of good feelings. The end of this political unity. So back up a little bit. So what's the era of good feelings? The era of good feelings is this tremendous opportunity that emerges after 1803 or 1804. Once the Federalist Party is destroyed in 1815, we have one party system, which is the Democratic Republicans. Federalists don't exist anymore after 1815. Everyone is a Democratic Republican. Remember why everybody's a Democratic Republican is the War of 1812. The Federalists support Britain. And so the era of good feelings is this period when everybody is all in one party. Most people are agreed. There's tremendous economic growth and economic development. There's a tremendous amount of trade. And suddenly that ends when the British Orders in Council block American flour exports, and we get the Panic of 1819. The Panic of 1819 is going to fracture the U.S. party system, which had been just a one-party state from 1815 to 1820 or so, into 4 parties by 1824 that are called caucuses. We'll talk about why that happens in a little bit. And I'll talk about the sort of rise of Andrew Jackson in response to the Panic of 1819. Okay, are there questions? Okay. I'd like to do a quiz now, so bear with me here. Oh, yes. So sorry, there were a couple of Era of Good Feelings lasts only 4 years. Yeah, yeah. The panic was a mini Great Depression. In fact, there are lots and lots of people who lose everything, lose their farms, lose everything. This is, in fact, a lot of people talk about Thomas Jefferson and say that Jefferson, kept his slaves and promised to free his slaves and never did. The reason that Jefferson never uh, does free his slaves, or one of the reasons why, is that he loses everything in the Panic of 1819, and so as a result, his Monticello, which is his plantation, is given up. He is forced into bank. In fact, not exactly bankrupt, but he has nothing left when he dies, and as a result, all of his enslaved people are auctioned off to other folks. So this affects kind of lots and lots and lots of people. Tremendous background. Oh yeah. So basically, that's it's a great question. Recapping the events that lead up to the panic. So what we see is a credit bubble. So there's a tremendous amount of credit that's available through the Caterpillar banks. The credit that goes all the way down to farmers through the stores. And questions that are being raised by the Second Bank of the United States over all this credit and whether it's stable or unstable. And then the event that and what it depends on, this period of prosperity in the United States from, say, 1803 to 1819 depends in part on the need for food in Europe, but also the need for food in the Caribbean. And this all goes to crap when the British Orders in Council say, make it much, much harder for Americans to sell flour to the Caribbean. Once that happens, once flour prices drop considerably, the whole credit system collapses. Farmers can't pay off their debts to stores. Stores fail, and as a result, banks fail. Farmers can't pay off the land that they bought on credit from the land office, and as a result, many of them go into bankruptcy. And that's the Panic of 1819. The Panic of 1819 is the biggest, I would say, the biggest depression in American history. Long-term effects of the Panic of 1819 are that the U.S. is no longer going to primarily export flour. The biggest export, say between 1815 and 1820, flour is neck and neck with flour and wheat is neck and neck with cotton. After 1819, cotton there's going to be initially 8 times as much and then 10 times as much cotton exported out of the United States as flour and wheat. And so the U.S. is going to become a cotton society. Cotton is going to be the primary export, and no longer flour and wheat is no longer going to be as important. After people had to sell their land, we see. That's basically it. Is people are forced to give up their land. They declare bankruptcy. In this period, there were lots of people that end up in prison because if you can't pay your debts in this period, up until 1836, you could end up in prison until your debts are paid. Okay. And now I'm going to go to ELC and turn on this quiz. Bear with me here for a second. Today is the 16th. Would cotton being the primary export be the only long-term effect? That's a good question. No, there are other long-term effects that we'll talk about. One of them is going to be that to the extent that the U.S. exports flour, it's going to be across the Great Lakes to Canada. And so one of the beneficiaries of all of this, one of the beneficiaries of the Orders in Council is that Canada is going to be a much more important entrepot or trading place for the West Indies. And so Americans are going to sell their flour to Canada after 1819, and that the flour and pork and beef and things like that from Canada are going to flow to the United States. This benefits Canada at the expense of the United States, but it also benefits states that are farther north. So states that are in like New York, Illinois, Ohio are going to benefit at the expense of flour producers in, say, Baltimore, in, say, Maryland or Virginia. And so what we're going to see is an increasing sectionalization, where wheat is going to be a northern good increasingly, and cotton is going to be a southern good. And so it's going to help contribute to the divide between the North and the South. Yeah, the quiz is available now, and will be till a little bit. Thanks so much, everybody. Sorry to start late, and see you guys on Thursday. Bye, everybody. Send me an emoji. Let me know you're gone.